Does child sponsorship really work? International child sponsorship is for many churches an easy entree into global missions. Today, it has grown into a multi-billion-dollar-a-year charitable enterprise. And with the growing numbers of children being displaced by war and global turmoil, those figures will continue to rise. But does child sponsorship really work? What is the actual impact on the children sponsored and their sponsors? And most importantly, is the gospel being both demonstrated and proclaimed?
This episode of The Mission Table is brought to you in partnership by 1615 Church Missions Coaching and Food for the Hungry. The world is hungry, but the emptiness goes far beyond the table. The need is physical and spiritual. People hunger for opportunity, starve for resources, and have been stripped of value. At Food for the Hungry, we seek to end all forms of human poverty by going into the hard places and closely walking with the world's most vulnerable people. We actively partner with churches, businesses, donors, and sponsors so that in more than 20 countries around the world, Food for the Hungry provides life-changing resources such as clean water, medical aid, food, education, vocational training, spiritual development, and hope. Food for the Hungry. Let's end poverty together.
Watch, reason, and participate. Join us for this episode of The Mission Table. Welcome to Season 2 of The Mission Table. This season, we are again tackling some of the most critical and controversial topics impacting missions today. And the way we do that at this table is by asking questions. We want to ask questions that move conversation, and our hope is that those conversations move God's people to action. I'm pleased to have with me today Randall Davey, Director of Church Engagement at Food for the Hungry, Bob Church, Administrative Pastor at Sagebrush Community Church in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Doug Lucas, Founder and President at Team Expansion, and Denny Spitters, Vice President of Church Partnerships Pioneers. So gentlemen, the question I have today is a bit controversial. That's the idea behind the table. We want to challenge the way people think, what they think, teach them how to think. Does child sponsorship really work? What is the impact on not only the sponsors, but also the sponsored? Now, before we get into that, let me just frame the question briefly. International child sponsorship has grown into a multi-billion-dollar-a-year charitable enterprise. Mm-hmm. And if you consider the growing number of orphans from war and displacement, those numbers are probably just going to go up. But does child sponsorship really work? What is the impact on the sponsors and the sponsored? The table's yours.
We're talking about this, and I think it's, from my perspective, in the church world, we do lots of child sponsorships in the areas that we work, and personally, I love them. Now, and here's why. First of all, is I think it's really, really important. It's a great way to get unengaged people in our congregations to be open up to compassion. There's just something about helping a child. It's just a natural thing. I mean, what parent doesn't want to help a child? And second is that what we have found in the countries that we work in, we have a campus in Belize, and what we found is that if we can reach a child, we can reach his parents. And so if we love that child and care for that child and provide for that child, then we get an open audience. And it might take a little time, but that child might come to a service, might come to church, but then eventually, because of that influence, their parents are going to come too. And then we have the opportunity to share Christ with the parents. So that's why we like child sponsorships. We think they work.
I wrote some folks, Matthew, in preparation for this because I really wanted to inquire. And I mean, on the surface, it sounds like who wouldn't be for sponsoring children? I mean, they're always in a vulnerable spot. And in fact, this morning I was up kind of early, communicating back and forth with some of these folks who responded. And one leader of a mission agency that's gotten into child sponsorships a lot, his name is Doug, also, he said, I always knew that it was going to be of benefit over there, but what I had missed was how much benefit it was over here for the church leaders and the church members And in communication with another friend named Dave from Savannah, Georgia, he said his church is changing their name from, it was called Savannah Christian Church. They're changing it to Compassion Christian Church because they have such a heart for things like this. And he said the heart muscle is like any other muscle in the body. It needs exercise. And he said, if you start with $50 a month sponsoring a child, then you're more likely to want to sponsor something bigger because you've gotten hooked on helping the world. But some of the answers came back and quite surprised me. The founder of the CHE movement, Community Health Evangelism, wrote back in the middle of today, actually, and he said, I just want you to know I'm not for this. I feel like it creates a dependency. And once that donor pulls the plug on that financial stewardship, the child can sometimes wonder, what did I do wrong? Did I not communicate enough?
Sure.
Was our family being devious with the money? And this guy said there are a whole lot of problems with this. So as a result, I don't advocate for it.
Well, that's a fascinating response. And I think to the simple question, do sponsorships work? I would say yes and no. Because once again, we have to ask what kind of sponsorship. And so if there's a sponsorship plan in mind that addresses that concern, it works. But we then have to define, what does works mean? Is there pragmatic value? Yes. But one of the things I'm pleased, and I can talk about it because I had nothing to do with its design, but the organization with which I'm serving now goes in with the end in mind. And one of the questions I raised early on, is this the most effective way to get money to that person? One of the questions is, how much of my donor dollar gets to the field?
Sure.
And it's a legitimate question. And a person said, well, if you want 100% to go to somebody and have no overhead, just give it to a person on the street corner. If you want a delivery system that says we're trying to address all of the systemic issues and do something to alleviate extreme poverty and have an exit strategy in mind so that that child does not run the risk of that, then as Bob's church is so exemplary, partner with the community so that it's not a one-on-one, because people will fall away.
Well, I'll put my head out on the chopping block a whole lot more and say, yes, it works, but just because it works, there are other questions that we really have to ask. Is it missions? That's one question. Is it strategic? That's another question. Who is responsible for the orphans, widows, etc., in other places other than where I live? Now, full disclosure here, my wife of 44 years and I have supported children. We have no children. We've been a part of that process, but not without asking some really hard questions that sometimes are very difficult to get answers to, much like the person who gave you the response he did. I would say that the pushback on child sponsorship is there's a real lack of strategic thinking about it. Does it work? You know, the vast majority of the top 10 agencies, so to speak, or orgs that receive money, the top 2 or 3 are all child sponsorship missions. And, you know, God bless them. I think there's a great inequality, however, to what's really being done in mission and whether that should even be viewed as mission. So I look at it and say, there are some real issues. There's the issue of dependency that you mentioned before, that he talked about, the issue of family rifts in the family because one child gets chosen, but the rest don't. Political issues where sometimes families have to make choices in order to become involved in those programs and make choices that they wouldn't normally make, but the pressure is there. And I'm not saying this is true of all orgs again. It's not. It varies a lot. You mentioned that before. Cultural confusion, the whole idea that, you know, many times children see all this and it creates a desire level, unfrustrated desires. They're like, wow, look at where my sponsor lives. Look at what they do. Look at the cars they drive. And I think that we don't think about those things because I believe that at the heart of the child sponsorship thing, it's about us. It's about how we feel about ourselves. I feel good about it. Like you said, it's an easy entry point. I can feel good that I'm doing something. I've heard people say, oh, I do some missions. I sponsor 3, 4 kids. I'm like, what does that really mean? There's a great movie out. In some ways, the movie itself is not great, but I think it illustrates this. It's called What About Schmidt? And it's Jack Nicholson is starring in it. And it's basically about a guy from the Midwest who is retired. He's lost his wife. He's lost. He doesn't really know how to communicate with his daughter that he's estranged from, but he begins to actually share his deepest kind of yearnings and longings and conflicts with Ndugu, a child sponsor that he begins to pick up that his wife has originally kind of got him into. And he pours himself out to Ndugu in letters. And I say, wow, that's a great picture of many times what people really are doing emotionally. And I think counter to that, I would throw something else on the table. The whole idea of books like The White Man's Burden, which every Christian should read, every Westerner should read, which is significant. And also When Helping Hurts, talks about these very dependency when we're actually, and I've done it firsthand. I've, in my generosity, poured out my pockets, left with the clothes on my back, only to find out in my own short-sightedness, but great generous heart, feeling good about myself, that I did more harm than good and created issues that clouded the ability of the gospel to really be seen clearly. Those are key issues.
Well, and let me address that because I think it's important that, from our perspective, from a church perspective, because I want to speak to churches directly, is that when we look at child sponsorship, we don't look at it just as child sponsorship. We look at child sponsorship and say, what is the end game? So that's when we work with Food for the Hungry and know they have an exit strategy. It's all about sustainability. Our child sponsorship that we're working on in Haiti, that we're getting ready to, it's called Save a Seat. It's sustainable. It's something that it's really just, it's education. That's all it is. It's getting a kid an education to get them an opportunity to have a job in the future. In Belize, it's the same thing. It's a functionality of sustainability. And so that's the one thing that we look at is that we don't want to create that dependability, because that's the worst thing that we can do. And so we always ask those questions. So it's not just kind of a carte blanche child sponsorship. Is who the organization that we're working with, what's the focus of that, and we do child sponsorships ourselves through the local churches that we work with, and like in Juarez, we have after school programs, we have lunch programs in Belize, but those are all through our partners, our local churches, our campuses that we deal with. And so I think that's really, really important is that I agree with you. I think sometimes it can be all about that person where they're checking that box like, well, yeah, I'm engaged because I send $35 a month and I get a letter and we send our picture but yet if there's a real strategy, and I think for leaders, that's the important question is, are we asking as leaders that question? Is it sustainable? Are we creating dependency? When does helping hurt? All those kind of things. I think it gives us a different maybe model or perspective on child sponsorship.
I think I love your answer, yes and no.
Absolutely.
It can work, but it can also fail miserably.
Absolutely.
Can I interrupt you before you ask this next question?
Please.
I guess I just did, didn't I?
You did.
I did, okay. Denny, what I thought about when you were talking is to say that was a good illustration of the point that I was making. It sounds to me like you've had a lot of exposure to groups that might have done, or some organizations that might have done harm. Now, I never try to assess what Bob's motives might be, if he feels good or feels badly. What I recognize, one of the reasons that Food for the Hungry does not encourage Doug to sponsor Denny, so that's your kid, is that there's organizations that will do that.
That's right.
The problem is if you're one of 7 or one of 3 and you're sponsored, the other 2 are not, it can cause a lot of internecine strife. A friend of mine by the name of Jim Koppel has an organization called Servant Forge. He's a policy wonk in Washington, D.C., does a lot of work in Kenya, and he's always over there. I said, Jim, how do you get off the airplane and be surrounded by kids and not give something to them? which is what I did. And he said, well, because I don't want to be beaten up. And that's what will happen. And he said, that's why you have to look beyond that. And so I don't know that the key question is sponsorship or not sponsorship, but it's saying how does that contribute overall to God's agenda? Because it's not about our agenda. I think the scriptures made that clear that we have a responsibility, and hopefully these kind of conversations can say, and here's where we've messed up in the delivery system.
Yeah, I've been part of that. I mean,
So
you
have
said
I.
other people. No, I've done it. I think I just talked with a good friend of mine the other day, and I said, you spent 15 years in Laos. What about the child sponsorship thing in your world? Like, if we could come to the 5-6 villages that you are seeking to plant churches in and come alongside, would you want to see that there? And he said, absolutely no. And I'm like, why not? Because we could bring in education. We could bring in these kids getting fed 1 meal a day solid. And he said, it's a Band-Aid. It is not, it will continue the cycle. Well, why do most of the kids not eat there? Well, because most of them have parents that are either drug addicts on dope and opium, or have chosen to walk a different path where they're abandoning their children, even though they live at home. And I'm like, well, then what is the solution? He said, planting a viable church that has disciples of Christ that will be able to stop the cycle without constant outside intervention and process, honoring the discipleship process in Laotian people's lives to really give them a chance to really do the very things that we should be responsible as well in our own backyard. And I thought, okay, that's an interesting view. And I think that that's something, like I like what you had to say about the church. I know that there are some great organizations that partner directly with the church and have moved in that direction. And we're not using a lot of names here, but I know World Vision is one of those. That is huge. When we empower the local church instead of empowering aid organizations, which have kind of really brought in a massive amount of corruption and a massive amount of, just a vision and a view of what it means to be a rich Westerner and many times coupled with the gospel. It's unhelpful. It isn't bringing the church forward.
Your head is on the chopping block now.
Well, yeah, it is on the chopping block. And once again, I sponsor a child, but my response to that and giving to that has got a lot of balance. I am pouring the vast majority of what I believe is taking the gospel and giving the Great Commission to make disciples where they're not.
It's a great time to ask another question, Matthew.
Well, I don't want to diss any ministries out there. I'm not going to mention names, but I think we have to recognize all child sponsorship ministries or community transformation ministries, whatever you want to call them, are not created equal. Sure. And I think we're hitting on some things that a discerning giver might want to look for when they're giving to an organization. One is, do they have an exit strategy? Are they just throwing money at a problem? Are they going to create dependency? Are they creating unrealistic connections between sponsor and sponsored, those things? Hit on connection to a local church. That's another one. Is it rooted and connected to a local church, an indigenous church, or is it its own thing, which is going to be a problem? Right. So let's talk about some of those characteristics that we would look for.
Well, my friend Doug pointed me to this Christianity Today article, 2013. So I looked that up this morning and read it. And I love the fact that they tracked 10,000 children from 6 different countries over a period of several years to find out, did it work? And one of the taglines that the authors wrote, they said, you can beat up this data however you want, and it will not show anything else but education levels rise. In every case where child sponsorships happen. So it is not just a theory. It's documented and now objectively proven that education levels arise. Of course, my son's working on a doctorate in Harvard, and he's in a research-oriented doctorate, and he constantly badgers me about asking the question of what causes things. We don't know what exactly causes that education uptick, but it's associated in some way with child sponsorship. And the stories, Matthew, you know them. One guy who wrote me back, his name is Roger. We worked for a phone company, started an organization to start making a difference like this. And Roger wrote me just this morning and said, Doug, I can tell you about Veronica. we heard her crying in an outhouse, in the reservoir, in an outhouse. Her mother had just delivered her. She was an infant, not more than a day old. We got her out of that outhouse and cleaned her up and put her into the church-to-church child sponsorship program that we have. She's now growing up, adopted by a Christian family, and is healthy again. And, you know, I think about Veronica and I think, well, that's one girl's life from the bottom of an outhouse to a Christian family who's going to now get her to heaven. And I'm thinking, how can I not be for that? But what that Christianity Today article does not address is what happens to the majority of those kids in regard to the church.
Right.
Are they involved in churches? Are they won to Christ? And that's more difficult to measure, I guess, in terms of metrics. So when you ask the question, does it work? There are some places where it's definitely working, there's no doubt.
I typed that question into Google just to see what would happen. Hundreds
of hits.
Hundreds in a row.
Yeah.
Nobody, you've got to get down to at least a couple hundred before you see something. Why not to sponsor a child? The overwhelming, it works, and the research shows it. But the research isn't necessarily asking the questions. And for us as the church, not just the church in the West, the global church, we have to ask some really strategic questions. And once again, I'll go back. Is it missions? Is it missions? It might be. It
You're saying
could
it
be.
might be
But it's
benevolence, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, yeah.
And who's responsible at that point biblically?
Yeah.
How does the pattern or the flow of that really follow? So I think those are important things that hardly I hear your church dealing with it and wrestling with it. I don't see churches doing that, and that's troubling.
Yeah, and I think it really, I think some of it boils back down to is that whole, you know, I think it's absolutely imperative on the church to do their homework, do their research. And here's one thing that's, because we ask that question all the time of our strategic partnerships. It's not just, is the partnership working, but what is it doing for the gospel? How
Absolutely.
many people
Amen.
are coming to Christ? And I have to tell you, this is Food for the Hungry. We work with Food for the Hungry in Ethiopia, in an area in Ethiopia that's
Sounds like a
90.
Food for the Hungry commercial now.
Yeah, no, but it's, you know, but 90% Muslim. And we have, over the last few years, we have 84 confirmed baptisms in that area, in a Muslim, 90% Muslim country, an area that we work in. And I go, that's working. That it's working. And so, you know, because that's a question, Danny, that we are always constantly asking. And I think the church needs to ask that question is that we don't want to become a social agency. That's not the church's role in this world. Our role in this world is to get people to Jesus. You know, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and yet lose his own soul? And so you're absolutely right. What is the missional part of that? Where are those souls? And I think we have to keep asking that question over and over again when it relates to child sponsorship. What's the gospel impact?
So there's
Well, and 84 baptisms, that's phenomenal. I'd go a step further. Are they becoming disciples?
Sure.
Are they being brought into the church? Is a church being formed? Then, yeah, that's mission.
You bet.
But I don't see that very often.
Sure.
I rarely see it, and it's very disjunct. So, and don't get me wrong again, I'm not trying to set up the dichotomy of compassion versus evangelism or anything. I'm not dealing with that. I'm saying, what is this really showing over the long term, and what are the results to the obedience to the Great Commission?
Denny, I guess I keep thinking as I listen to you, are we applying that same grid to the church you and I attend?
Absolutely.
If we look at how many teens that grow up in the church that are no longer in the church, tracking that. And also, we're also talking very anecdotally here to say what I see or what I know. I know a snippet. I can't be responsible for results. I can only be responsible for right activities. I can share the gospel, but I can't be responsible whether you respond or not. But I think it might obfuscate the fact that there are organizations that have asked hard questions to say, if I can help Bob, who right now cannot take care of his own family, if I can help him learn how to use advanced techniques in agriculture so he can now support through that and increase education and deworm his children and voice that through the church. I know the organization I'm part of, and since we're not mentioning names, I won't mention Food for the Hungry, but I know part of their interest there is to say, what does holistic ministry look like? The other thing that flashed through my mind when you were making controversial comments there a minute ago, Denny, was how many churches started daycare centers as a ministry
Still do.
that were not. So I became pastor of a church years ago. They had a robust school. It helped fund a lot of things. And I said, I'd like to talk to the teachers and just find out how does the vision of the church. They all said, well, our pastor has not interfaced. I said, so in other words, we just have a school, and the fact that it's in a church does not make it a ministry. This is not a ministry. So I know in Africa, the case in Kenya, where a church developed dug a well for the community. And that was it. So there was no interface. People were coming, so it wasn't that nice, but that didn't make it a ministry. But I also know that if I can share and plumb the depths of Revelation or Daniel with somebody, and if they're starving or they're cognitively deficient, they're probably not going to get it. So at least this organization, I know there are others, say we've got to do the opposite of creating dependency, but self-sufficiency. And we're not coming in, Bob alluded to this earlier, we're not coming in with we got the answers, but how can we serve you in accomplishing what's important for you?
I think we've hit on another thing that we would look for, the discerning giver, is what's the role of the gospel in your mission? Is it central?
Absolutely.
Or is it marginal?
Absolutely.
Does this organization
Absolutely.
work with and value the local church? Do they believe in the primacy of the local church? Right? Not only on field, but that sponsors churches.
Absolutely.
You know, one of the things we didn't hit on, and it'll be our last point here, we'll wrap it up. But what about the impact on the sponsors? Okay, so having a high view of the local church, believing in the primacy of the church matters on field, but it also matters as that organization interfaces with churches in the U.S. that have the money.
So I want to pick on Denny again. Denny,
Come on,
He's
man.
empty, man.
My
So-
head's out there.
Yeah, well, I just want to agree with Doug that we think you're wrong about this point.
Great.
And that is, you said, it's about us. It makes us feel good. I don't try to burden myself with trying to figure out what your motive is. I do know that if I'm in right behavior that's rooted in the scripture, I'll let the Spirit work on you about if you're feeling really condescending because you, the great white man, can do something. But the action is right. If I can be faith-centered, word-based, I think the Spirit's job is to help us know where we're out of alignment.
I think you're right, Matthew, about asking, what do you look for? Another friend wrote me back this morning. His name is Greg, and he works with an organization that has partnered very closely with one of these larger compassion type organizations doing child sponsorships. And he said, I went down and saw the girl the picture on our fridge. I went down and saw her when she was 5 years old. We went back to see her again when she was 9. We went back to see her again when she was 13. We went back to see her again when she was 18, and we saw her graduate. She's now a leader in her local church, and we see the impact she's having on a local church. You will never, ever be successful at convincing Greg of anything else in the world except that his $50 a month throughout that time caused this young lady to be a change agent in society. Guy called me this morning. He called me at 4 a.m. because he
You
saw
must
that
have done nothing but on your email and call
I
all
know.
day.
He called me at 4 a.m. He saw I was active on our organization's internet, and he's a mobilizer of the organization. And he called and said, I want to pray for you, brother, because I know this is a controversial topic.
Yeah.
He said, but the truth of the matter is, just what you just said, Randall, I don't really need for other people to try to check and verify my work in supporting the girl that's on our fridge.
Yeah.
Because you know what? What matters to me is my faithfulness to my duty to look out for the orphans in the world. And this is how I'm doing it. So I'm going to pray for you because I don't want anything to take away from that girl in my fridge and the difference that I'm making. It's very controversial.
And from and going back to, because my perspective is from a church perspective, is that I think one of the results that we're looking for the sponsor is that it is so easy in America to be a consumer.
Yep.
And we're so used to, even church, people come and go, what am I going to get out of it? what's in it for me?
Yep.
And we become so consumer oriented. And if we can take somebody out of that consumer mindset and begin to, just maybe in rudimentary stages, begin to give them a heart for somebody else,
Sure.
whether that person has nothing, whatever, just a heart for somebody else to look outside of their own sphere. And that maybe might give them a heart for their coworker in that's going through a divorce in their cubicle next to them, or somebody who's, elderly who just wants a friend. If we can change the mindset of that consumer mentality that comes to that church every single week of, well, it was too loud. The worship, I didn't like that song. I didn't like this. I didn't like that. What's in it for me? Well, you didn't have this for my kids, or you didn't have that, or I couldn't sit in my favorite seat, so I'm leaving. All those kind of things. All those things that you see in the church that make you crazy, because it's like, but that's not the Jesus style.
Sure.
Jesus was always looking for that person on whom he could have compassion for. And if we can do that through maybe the vehicle of child sponsorship, or just getting them a glimpse that there's a whole nother world out there that doesn't live like you at all, then we feel like at least we've moved the ball.
Yes.
And moved their heart a little bit. And I think that's really important to us. And we don't want to maximize them or minimize it, but just let it be what it is. But if we can move them into compassion in other areas of their life, then we'll leave it at that.
You're going to owe me dinner after this, but a church that we coach and help them develop their strategy, one of their components is community transformation, and they partnered with FH. And it was through FH that they got introduced to When Helping Hurts. That was their first exposure to how do we do ministry in a way that doesn't create dependency. They talk a lot about mutual transformation now. They're not only working with FH, they're also working with an unreached people group. But that mindset of mutual transformation and doing ministry in a way that empowers, that doesn't hurt, was something they learned from their relationship with you. So it's interesting. It was a strategic organization with an end in mind, with a gospel-centeredness and a focus on the local church. They're now taking that domestically and also internationally. So in conclusion, I think we're saying child sponsorship can work, and it might not work, depending on who you work with.
No doubt.
So be discerning as a churchman, as a church member, as a missions pastor. All sponsorship ministries for children are not created equal.
Right.
Be discerning. Hopefully listen to some of the things that we've said here today, and God bless you. Thanks, guys, for being here.
Continue the conversation at missiontable.org. This episode of The Mission Table has been sponsored by Encountering the World of Islam, embracing Muslims with the love of Christ. Growth Mission, investing in people and organizations to maximize kingdom growth. And in partnership with Food for the Hungry, ending poverty together. And 1615, Church Missions Coaching.